The telegram in Jubal Tate's pocket had asked for a bride of delicate constitution, refined habits, and modest proportions. And the woman climbing down off the noon stage was making liars of all three words at once. She came down the steps without taking the offered hand of the driver, because she did not appear to need it. And when her boots hit the dust of Cedar Gulch, the boards of the boardwalk seemed to take notice. She was tall as Jubal and near as broad through the shoulder, with forearms a blacksmith would have respected. And she set down a trunk that had taken 2 men to load as though it were a hatbox. And she looked around that dusty street, with the frank assessing calm of a woman deciding whether the town would do. Jubal Tate stood frozen by his wagon with the delicate bride telegram crinkling in his pocket and no earthly idea what to say. And then, before he could say anything at all, his own fool horse spooked at a banging shutter and bolted, and the woman from the stage caught it. On foot, in 3 strides, by the bridle, without seeming to hurry. If you have ever shown up exactly as you are and watched somebody's careful little plans fall to pieces around it, stay with me, because this is the story of a man who sent away for a small quiet wife and got something a great deal better, and spent a good while being too foolish to know it. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now come back to that street in the Montana grass, to a frozen man and a bolting horse, and a woman who has just caught it barehanded, because the look on his face is a story all by itself. Her name was Permelia Stokes, Mel. She'd tell you inside a minute, because she had no patience for a long name on a short acquaintance. And she was 29 years old, and built, in her own cheerful accounting, like something meant for serious work. She had grown up the only daughter among 6 sons of a Nebraska teamster, and she had learned to do everything her brothers did, and most of it better. She could shoe a horse, break a colt, throw a steer, drive a 6-up team through weather that turned grown men back, and outrun, on her own 2 feet, any animal on the place over a short stretch, a thing her brothers had wagered good money on against strangers more than once, and never lost. She was a big woman and a strong one, and she had decided, somewhere around the age of 16 when she'd grown taller than every boy who might have courted her, that she was not going to spend her life apologizing for being exactly the size and strength God and good food had made her. The world had a great deal to say about a woman like that. Mel Stokes had stopped listening to most of it a long time ago, and what she could not stop listening to she had learned to answer with a level look that closed the subject. She had answered Jubal Tate's advertisement not because she dreamed of a delicate match. She could read, and the words delicate and modest proportions had told her exactly what kind of disappointment she was riding toward. But because the advertisement also said the man kept a high horse ranch in the Montana mountains and needed a partner who could work. And Mel Stokes had wanted a horse ranch in the mountains her whole life, and figured a man fool enough to ask for a dainty bride to run one would be glad enough, once he came to his senses, to have someone who could actually do the job. She had packed her trunk and her saddle and her father's good rope and a crock of starter her mother had given her, and she had come west with her eyes open and her expectations modest, which is the best armor there is. The stage driver had given her the lay of the man on the ride in. Jubal Tate. Runs the Tate string up in the high parks, good horses, best in the territory, and a lonesome operation since his partner Dell passed. He'd shaken his head. Him and Dell built that ranch from nothing, 20 years, more brothers than partners. Then Dell took a fall off a green colt 2 winters back and never got up. And Jubal, well, he runs it alone now, and he don't say much, and he's got it in his head, near as anybody can tell, that what that empty ranch house needs is a sweet little wife to make it cheerful again. Sent off for a delicate bride, the driver had looked sidelong at Mel, all 6 solid feet of her, and had the grace to swallow a grin. I expect, he'd said carefully. "The two of you are going to have a conversation." The Tate Ranch sat high in a string of mountain parks, the grass deep and the horses fine, and it was a sound place gone quiet, which is a gentler thing than gone to grief but kin to it. The barns and the corrals and the horseflesh were immaculate, because a man can pour himself into the work he shared with the partner he lost. But the house itself had the look of a place a man only slept in, and meant, someday, to make nice for somebody. There was lumber stacked on the porch for a swing never built, and a tin of paint gone hard by the door, and a general air of a man waiting for a delicate bride to arrive and make the place soft. Having never once considered that softness was not the only thing a house could be missing. There were 2 chairs on the porch where 2 men had sat 20 years, and one of them never moved now. And the kitchen told the rest the way kitchens do. Clean enough, a careful man's kitchen, but bare and joyless, the range used only for coffee and salt pork, the pantry holding nothing that took the time a person takes when there is someone to feed and some pleasure in the feeding. Jubal Tate, once he'd got his caught horse back and his wits half together, tried to deliver the speech he had plainly rehearsed. He was sorry, he said, going red. But there had been a misunderstanding. He'd sent for that is, he'd been expecting a woman of a Moor. He gestured vaguely, helplessly, at the general idea of small. He hadn't expected, and here he ground to a halt, because Mel Stokes was looking at him with her head tilted and the faint beginnings of a smile, not hurt, not angry, just waiting to see if he'd dig the hole any deeper. "You hadn't expected a woman who could catch your horse," she finished for him, mildly, "Mr. Tate. You advertised for a wife to help run a mountain horse ranch. I'm the best hand you'll ever hire, and I came ready to marry the job whether or not I ever warmed to the man. You wanted Dainty. What you needed was somebody who could do the work, and you're lucky enough to have got her instead of what you asked for. Now, you going to stand there grieving the little woman you imagined, or you going to show me the horses?" And she picked up her trunk, alone, again, easily, and started toward the house, and Jubal Tate, who had never in his life been talked to quite like that and was startled to find he did not entirely mind it, followed her with no notion of what had just happened to him. She did not weep over his rudeness, and she did not pack to leave. She'd been measured by men's small imaginations her whole life, and had long since stopped letting their lack of vision count as her problem. She simply went to work, because work was the one language she'd always spoken without apology, and inside of a week she had made herself so plainly indispensable that the question of her proportions stopped coming up for sheer lack of room on the day's list. She gentled a colt Jubal had near given up on, talking it down in an afternoon with a patience and a strength in her hands that made him stop and watch from the rail. She doctored a mare's bowed tendon that he thought would end her, with a poultice and a wrap, and a knowledge of horse leg that ran deeper than his own. She found the spring box behind the house gone foul and fixed it before noon. And on the 3rd morning she baked bread, from the crock of starter her mother had pressed on her, and the smell of it went through that quiet waiting house like something it had been missing for 2 years, out the door and across the yard to the round corral, where Jubal Tate stopped with a lead rope in his hand and stood very still, like a man remembering a thing he'd meant to get around to and never had. He came in at noon and stopped 3 steps inside the door, and for once it was not grief that stopped him, but plain astonishment at the smell, and the warmth and the impossible cheer of a kitchen that had been bare and silent for 2 years, and was now, somehow, alive. He looked at the loaves cooling, and then at the woman who'd made them, sleeves shoved up over those formidable forearms, flour to the elbow, entirely at home, and something shifted in his face that he was not quick enough to hide. Mel cut the heel off the first loaf and set it buttered at his place. She did not give him her back the way a more delicate woman might have. She watched him eat it, frankly, because she wanted to see, and he ate it, and his eyes closed for one helpless second, and she nodded once as though a thing had been settled. "When'd you last eat a meal made in this house?" she asked. It was a while before he answered. 2 years, he said. He had not meant to say the number, and she watched him be surprised by it. He went back out to the horses a little too fast. That night, after Mel had gone to her room, she heard him on the porch late, hammering, and in the morning the lumber that had sat stacked 2 years was a porch swing, hung and solid, big enough, she noted, for 2 people of considerable size to sit in, without anybody perching, and he didn't say a word about who he'd built it broad enough for. Neither did she. But she sat in it that evening, and after a while, without being asked, he came and sat in it too. And it held them both, and the quiet between them was a comfortable kind. It went on like that into the bright mountain autumn, the quiet house warming, and the work going twice as fast with 2 real hands at it, and the thing between them that had started as a joke at his expense turned slowly into something neither of them was joking about anymore. He found he liked being bested. He'd spent 2 years carrying the whole ranch and the whole grief of Dell alone, and there was a deep, unfamiliar ease in a partner who could actually take half, who could rope what he roped and lift what he lifted and laugh at him when he needed laughing at, and sit a comfortable silence when he didn't. He told her about Dell one evening on the broad swing, easier than he'd told anyone anything in 2 years, the partner who'd been the brother he chose, and how the ranch had felt like a clock with a spring gone since. Mel didn't fill the quiet with comfort. She let it be as big as it was, and after a while she said only that Dell sounded like a man worth missing, and that a ranch built by 2 good hands was likely lonesome for the second pair. And Jubal found that was somehow exactly the right thing, and exactly enough. And then the thing happened that made the whole town stop laughing about the bride who'd caught the horse and start telling a different story about her altogether. It was the autumn roundup. The one day the high parks filled with people. Neighbors, hands, families, the whole scattered country come together to sort and brand and trade. The nearest thing Cedar Gulch had to a holiday, and it was a holiday right up until a wagon team panicked. Nobody ever agreed afterward exactly what set them off. A snake, a gunshot, a flapping tarp. But a 4-horse team hitched to a heavy freight wagon went from standing to dead run in the space of a breath, straight down the long open slope of the gathering ground, and in the bed of that wagon, screaming, were the 2 littlest Hendry children who'd been put up there out of the way of the cattle. And on the seat was nobody at all, the driver having stepped down for one fatal moment. The team was running flat out for the rocks at the bottom of the slope, and there was not a mounted man near enough to catch them in time, and the whole roundup watched in the frozen horror of people about to see a thing they would never forget. Except Mel Stokes was on foot near the head of the slope, and Mel Stokes could outrun a horse over a short stretch, and she did not stop to think about whether she should. She came off the rise in a flat sprint. The great driving strength of those legs the town had snickered at eating the ground in strides no delicate woman could have managed, and she ran not at the team but at an angle to cut them, the way her brothers had taught her to head a runaway, judging the line in an instant, and she caught the cheek strap of the near leader at a dead run. And she did not try to stop 4 panicked horses by main force, which would have killed her, but threw her whole considerable weight sideways and hauled their heads around, turning the run into a circle, a great wheeling curve that tightened and tightened as she hung on and dug in and bent them away from the rocks, until the team, with nowhere to run but in a ring, ran themselves down to a blowing, trembling halt not 40 feet from the drop. And Mel Stokes, on her feet, filthy, gasping, still hanging on to the bridle of a horse 3 times her weight, reached up with her free hand and lifted the 2 Hendry children down out of the wagon bed and set them on the grass, and asked them, between heaving breaths, whether they were hurt, in the same mild voice she'd used on Jubal Tate the day she arrived. There was a silence over that whole round-up ground that you could have heard a leaf land in. And then there was a sound the country had never made for Mel Stokes before, which was the sound of 100 people who had just watched a woman do a thing not one of the men among them could have done. Jubal Tate reached her first. He had been running too, from too far back, and he got to her white-faced and shaking with the fear of what had nearly happened, and the worse fear of what could have happened to her, and he took her flour and dirt-streaked face in both his hands right there in front of the entire assembled country. And he said the first wholly unguarded thing she had ever heard out of him. "I sent for a dainty bride," he said, his voice wrecked, loud enough for the nearest of them to hear and not caring who did, "and God Almighty had the sense to send me you instead. And I have been the biggest fool in this territory for being slow to say so. There is not 1 inch of you I'd trade for all the delicate women ever born. Marry me, Mel Stokes. Not for the ranch. For you. Marry me, because I'd rather run last in a foot race beside you every day of my life than win one alone." Mel Stokes, who had caught a 4-horse team and lifted 2 children to safety and not lost her breath over any of it, found that this was the thing that finally undid her composure. One moment of it, her eyes going bright, her hand coming up to cover his where it cupped her dirty cheek. And then she got hold of herself, because she was who she was, and she said, "Well, it took a runaway team and an audience of the whole county. But you got there." And then, softer, just for him, "Yes, you great fool, of course yes." And the round-up ground, which had been silent, was suddenly not silent at all. If there was a soul left in Cedar Gulch inclined to laugh at the size of Jubal Tate's bride, the autumn round-up cured them of it, and the few who needed more curing got it at the wedding 3 weeks later, where the Hendry family stood up front as honored guests, and old man Hendry, who was not a man given to speeches, stood and said in front of the whole church that his 2 youngest were alive, because Parmelia Stokes could run down a horse, and that he'd like to see the dainty bride who could have done the same, and that anybody who'd ever snickered could come say so to him directly. Nobody did. The matrons who'd whispered about proportions found themselves with nothing to say, and the preacher, marrying them, observed that he'd joined a good many couples, but never one where he had so little worry about who'd be the strength of the household, which got a laugh, and which Mel acknowledged with a regal nod that got a bigger one. Because she was in on it now, the whole town was laughing with her, and not one soul was laughing at her. And there is no unseeing a thing like a woman save 2 children's lives, once a country has watched her do it. The years came up over the high parks the way the seasons do. The hard tin of paint by the door got thrown out, and the house got painted after all, but not soft and dainty the way Jubal had once vaguely imagined, painted strong and bright and welcoming. A working ranch house with a broad swing on the porch that held 2 large happy people of an evening. And Dell's empty chair finally got moved. Not away, but to the head of the table, where the children they had were told stories about the uncle who'd built the place with their father. Jubal Tate spoke his lost partner's name easily now, having learned that the dead are kept by the saying of their names and lost only in the silence. The Tate string grew to be the best in 3 territories, gentled by the finest pair of hands in the mountains, and folks came from a long way to buy a Tate horse, and went home telling stories about the rancher's wife, who was as tall as her husband, and twice as quick and could. It was said, and it was true, outrun the very horse she'd been so famously underestimated beside. Mel Tate baked her bread every morning of her life from the starter her mother gave her, and the smell of it went out across the high parks and down the mountain, and travelers would lift their heads at it and ask who lived up in the Tate parks and ate so well and laughed so loud. The mountains were what they had always been, high and old and indifferent, going about their seasons without consulting anyone, deep in grass in summer and deep in snow in winter, and never once concerned with the size or the speed of the people living among them. But there was a bright, strong house in the high parks now, with a fire that did not go cold, and a porch swing built for two, and a woman in it who had never once in her life asked the world's permission to be the size she was, and had simply gone on being it until the right man caught up. Jubal Tate had sent away for a dainty bride, the way a foolish man orders the thing he thinks he's supposed to want. What he got instead was a woman who could catch his horse and gentle his colts and turn a runaway team and lift his whole grieving life half off his shoulders. A woman the world had spent 30 years calling too big and too strong and too much. As though those were faults and not the very things that saved 2 children on a roundup ground and saved 1 lonesome man besides. He had learned, the way the lucky ones do, that he had never wanted Dainty at all. He had wanted enough, and here at last was a woman who was more than enough, and knew it, and had only been waiting for somebody with the sense to be glad of it. And she stayed. Though if you'd asked her, she'd have told you with a perfectly straight face that she'd had nowhere better to run.